Ken, how are you, man?
Well, good, my friend. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. First episode of the new year, the new decade.
Yep.
And this is going to be a fun one. So, in previous episodes, Ken, we've basically done sort of this extended guided tour through all the various elements of your integral model. So, a few months ago, we did a really, really fun trip through the stages of development using film clips
Right.
to sort of demonstrate, the main values and leadership styles associated with each stage. We did another episode shortly thereafter called The Many Ways We Grow, where we looked at multiple intelligences and lines of development. And then we talked about states of consciousness in an episode called The Varieties of Integral Spiritual Experience.
Right.
So all of this, basically, I thought today would be a really good opportunity for us to talk about another really, really critical element of integral, which is the four quadrants.
Yeah.
And this is going to be, I've sort of had quadrants on the brain lately, Ken. I've been doing this. This is the part where I kind of shamelessly plug, but I've been doing a lot of woodworking in the last year. I've been getting, really, really into it.
Right.
And I just started creating. I'll actually show these four quadrant portraits that I've been carving. So this one is made out of maple with bronze paint on there. And it's been so much fun making these. And I just want everyone who's watching to know these are available. If you want to buy one, you can do that. I am doing these for commission. So if you want a custom piece, just send me an email, Corey@integrallife.com, Corey@integrallife.com. And I'll be happy to work with you. And you can have your own special four quadrant plaque to put on your wall. So we can end the shameless plugging. But yeah, so the four quadrants, Ken, this is huge. And this is obviously a topic we could spend the next 12 hours unpacking, because there's just so much to talk about. And of course, the four quadrants, when it comes to your work, this is one of your most well-known contributions.
Yeah.
It was huge when you first rolled out the four quadrants several decades ago. Represented the fourth major stage, I believe, of your work. So I think we're gonna have a lot of fun today, kind of talking about this and unpacking this. You've said before in the past that the universe is not fundamentally made of things like atoms or molecules or wholes or parts or anything like that. It's fundamentally made of perspectives. So today we're going to talk about some of those perspectives, particularly the perspectives that give rise to the four quadrants of the cosmos. Well, and actually that's going to be one of the questions. Do the perspectives give rise to the quadrants? Do the quadrants give rise to the perspectives? That's going to be, I think, something fun for us to explore together.
Right.
So Ken, I was thinking to begin, maybe you could give us sort of a brief introduction of the four quadrants, the major polarities that they represent. And I was actually hoping you might be able to kind of start from the beginning in terms of your own personal story, really beginning with the day you discovered the four quadrants, the day sort of the whole universe came together and surrounded by legal pads. It's a cool story. I was hoping you could share that with us.
Yeah. Well, I had started out with this sort of basic integral orientation, trying to figure out how different systems fit together, and particularly how different systems, different disciplines, different fields that had to do with our own personal growth and development, but also just in general across the board. And so my first book, for example, Spectrum of Consciousness, I had become, in late adolescence, I'd become really interested in the various forms of growth that there were out there. And that included therapeutic growth, and included meditative systems, Zen, psychoanalysis, all of that, because they all claim to somehow help make human beings better. But they clearly seem to disagree with each other. So a very simplistic example is, for psychoanalysis, you have people that are unhappy, neurotic, suffering, and so on. And in order for them to get better, they have to create a whole and healthy ego. They have to create ego strength. And when they do that, then their neurosis will tend to die down. For something like Zen Buddhism, the idea is you have to get rid of your ego. So those don't seem to fit together very well. So I began looking at pretty much all the various systems of growth, therapy, enlightenment, awakening around the world, and started sort of just notice certain family resemblances and how those would kind of fit together. And one of the really important sort of breakthrough insights for me at that time was that consciousness wasn't just this thing, you know, we have consciousness or we don't, but that it really was much more like a rainbow, that there was a whole spectrum of different colors, different bands, different waves of consciousness. And there were, in terms of the overall kind of families of improvement, consciousness improvement, growth, development, there turned out to be around 6 or 7 major different schools that you could sort of group these different things together: the psychoanalytic, the humanistic, transpersonal, liberation, Zen, Vedanta, that kind of thing. And it dawned on me that there were also around 6 or 7 major levels of consciousness, 6 or 7 major bands in the spectrum of consciousness. And each of these major different types of growth or therapy or realization was really applying to one of the different levels of consciousness. And so there was a sense in which all of them had important things to tell us, but they were just dealing with different bands in the spectrum of consciousness. And so I was 23 at that time, and I wrote that up as my first book called The Spectrum of Consciousness. And then I started to look at just development. In general, I was curious how these actually developed. And originally, I took what was a very, very common assumption at the time, which was a bit of a romantic view, which is that when we talk about enlightenment as sort of being, realizing there's a ground of all being, and therefore realizing that you yourself are one with everything. And then we look at the development of human individuals. We find in the first several months of life, the infant feels that it's one with its environment. It really can't differentiate, can't tell where its body stops and the chair starts. So there's this kind of indissociation. And it was very easy to see that as like an early immature version of unity consciousness. And then we broke away from that and formed this separate rational ego, and that was suffering and neurosis and all that kind of horrible misery for human beings. But then if we kept growing, we could regain that original unity state, only now in a conscious fashion. And that was enlightenment or realization or so on. And so I actually started writing up, some people had started a journal based on my work. The journal is called Revision Journal. And I'd become involved in that. And so I was writing up a book on just this whole developmental scheme, and it was called the Atman Project. But the more I sort of thought about those early, apparently unity stages, and then the ultimate enlightened divine unity, ultimate unity consciousness, something just didn't quite, something was wrong about that. It wasn't totally clear to me. So I decided I would go back and just look at history on the whole, because you find in a whole lot of cultures the idea, these myths of an Eden, that human beings were once sort of whole and unified, and then there was a fall from Eden into our separate, isolated, fragmented, partial, suffering state. But then we could regain that paradise with enlightenment, realization, metamorphosis, satori, and so on. And so I started doing that. And the long and short of that one was, it became really clear that these early stages of unity. And I'll go back to the infant, today's infant, as an example. If we use, just as an example, and I'm not a total fan of the Christian version, but everybody tends to know this one. So the major sort of stages of development are matter to body to mind to soul to spirit. And that's generally referred to as a great chain of being. It's more like a great nest of being because these envelope each other. They're not just rigid rungs in a ladder. But what became really, really clear about this early infantile state of unity is that what the infant was one with, it wasn't one with matter and body and mind and soul and spirit. It wasn't one with all of those. It literally was one essentially with just the material environment. So it could indeed have this sense of oneness with this immediate material environment, but it didn't have mental concepts emerge. It didn't have a luminosity of soul. It didn't have a radical, infinite embrace of spirit. And if you look at Piaget, for example, when he was studying this early stage, and he noted that the infant's awareness was just really tracking nothing but material things. It wasn't even tracking bodily emotional impulses and stuff like that. And so Piaget said, quote, "The self is here material, so to speak." And so that's easy to confuse with an ultimate unity of the entire, one with the entire great chain. But it's actually just a unity with the lowest level in the great chain. So it's a unity, but it's the smallest possible unity you can ever have. And so that's not something that you want to recapture when you've developed your body and your mind and you're moving into soul and you're trying to realize spirit. You're not trying to get back down. It's just an unconscious, unreflexive, non-verbal, pre-personal, material self. That's not what you want. And so that's the way I then saw, I could see that in the whole unfolding the human race at large. And so I wrote a book intentionally called Up from Eden, that being the point. Now, what was happening, I went on to just sort of continue to expand these kinds of things. My training itself was in what we would end up calling the upper right quadrant, atoms, molecules, cells, organisms. My graduate degrees were in biochemistry. And from college, I had a dual bachelor's, one in biology, one in chemistry. So that was my training. But here I was looking at interiors and individuals, and then at interiors and collectives or cultures of humanity on the whole. And I had always had an enormous sympathy with systems theory. And what I didn't realize at any of those times was that those are actually what we call the four quadrants. About a dozen books later, and I've one of the easily most significant events in my life was meeting Treya, marrying her. 10 days after we were married, we discovered she had cancer, and we spent the next 5 years fighting cancer. I did write that up in a book called Grace and Grit, which is now a major motion picture.
Coming out this year.
In a few months, so we'll keep people posted. They can go see that. And so then when I sat down and had kind of recovered from her death and started to write, I hadn't written anything for really about 8 or 9 years because I was just constantly taking care of Treya. So I sat down to write this book, and it was clearly, I just had an enormous number of things in mind. And I sat down, I wrote the first paragraph, and by the time I got to the end of that paragraph, I knew something was just really wrong. And what had happened is that during that almost decade period, which is the late 80s and into early 90s, postmodernism had continued to infiltrate academia. And on the one hand, postmodernism was a positive development. It was called postmodern because it came after the previous modern stage of development. And the modern stage, which we call orange, was generally marked by rational cognition. And it had moved from the previous stage, our amber mythic membership stage, which was ethnocentric. It had moved up to world-centric. And this was only starting in around 1700. And world-centric was a profoundly different type of moral perspective, among other things, for human beings, and different type of identity. In ethnocentric stages, we were always identified with a particular group or groups. So we were Christians, and if you were Christian in the Middle Ages, then you had rights. And when you die, you're going to go to heaven and live on the right hand of God forever. But there are no Hindus in heaven. There are no Buddhists in heaven. They don't count. The Enlightenment philosophers looked at that and they said, wait, that's not right. Every single person worldwide has equal rights by simple virtue of being born a human. And so at that point, instead of just your special group getting rights, with the world-centric stages of modernity, we attempt to treat all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, gender, ethnicity, or creed. And that was radically new. And so that was one of the reasons that even though all the previous cultures essentially had slaves, including even the cultures that had introduced the great paths of enlightenment, waking up. As Thomas Sowell's History of Slavery put it, quote, Buddhist monasteries had slaves, Christian monasteries had slaves, pretty much every culture did. And then I've mentioned this before, but then in about a 100-year period from 1770 to 1870, slavery was outlawed in every single rational industrial country in the world. First time anything like that had happened. The modern sciences were all invented during that period because the major form of cognition had switched from mythic to rational. And so this was a profound change. Modern rational tended to believe in universal truths. So there wasn't Hindu chemistry and Jewish chemistry, there was just chemistry. And these universal truths were indeed what drove the study of and creation of a lot of modern sciences. Those two major stages, the ethnocentric, special rights, mythic membership stage, which marked, for example, all the way through the Middle Ages, and then the modern, rational, universal, world-centric stage, these were, as political orientations, the people supporting the existing ethnocentric state of affairs, they felt those needed to be conserved. And so they were conservatives. But then there was this newfangled group of people that at that time, they were so new, they didn't even have a political name or political philosophy. So they had to come up with a name for their political philosophy, and they called themselves liberal. And liberal came from liberty, and that's what the liberal was offering, was freedom for everybody, a universal freedom, hence freeing the slaves. Those two political parties, and as I've also mentioned, in the French Assembly of the time, the old conservatives sat on the right hand of the king, and these newfangled liberals sat on the left hand of the king. And those terms stuck, left and right. Left, progressive, liberal; right, conservative, ethnocentric. Those two were sort of at each other's throats, managed to live together pretty much until the 60s, when a yet new significant stage emerged, which was the green, postmodern, pluralistic, Graves called it relativistic stage. And there, they weren't so much interested in universal values, because all values had become relativistic. And because they were all relativistic, you really couldn't say just one of them is true and another is false. So you had this notion of egalitarianism. All values are equally important, and you can't just choose one. And because of that, it's not just that one culture has it right. All cultures have to be included and given equal significance. So we have multiculturalism. These ideas, again, there was some truth to them. They were true, but partial. And part of the problems is with this radical egalitarianism, they started to look at all hierarchies as being demonic, as being the source of oppression, evil, suffering, and there are no good hierarchies. They're all bad. So you have to flatten hierarchies everywhere. Now, the problem with that is that they confuse two very, very different types of hierarchies. There are dominator hierarchies, and they're all the bad things the postmodernists said about them. And in a dominator hierarchy, the higher up you go, the more people you can oppress, the more people you can hurt. So if you have somebody like Stalin at the top of a dominator hierarchy, then he can murder around 60 million people in the Gulag Archipelago. Adolf Hitler, top of his dominator hierarchy, murders 13 million people, around 7 million intellectuals, gypsies, gays, etc., and about 6 million Jews. These are horrible things. But then there are growth hierarchies. And growth hierarchies are exactly the opposite of dominator hierarchies. The higher you go in a growth hierarchy, the more inclusive you are. So there's an overwhelming amount of evidence, for example, that individuals, as they're born and then grow and develop, their identities continue to grow and expand. So they start out identified with just themselves, and they can't even take the role of other. They can't realize that people have perspectives different from theirs. But then if they keep growing, they'll expand their identity to entire groups, and they identify with those entire groups, and so that's called ethnocentric. And if a person stays stuck at ethnocentric, identified with just their own group, then it can become ethnocentric in a negative, unethical way. You can become racist or sexist or homophobic or xenophobic and so on. But if you keep growing, then you grow into world-centric. And that's where you attempt to treat all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And then you can even go into like cosmocentric and integral stages of development. So part of the problem, and this is, that was all a preface up to how I hit upon the quadrants. One of the words that I'd used in the first paragraph that was very clearly problematic is that in that roughly 10-year period that I hadn't been writing, I'd done about a dozen books up to that time, and they were all looking at developmental, by the way, the Arthur Koestler's term for growth hierarchies is what he called holarchies, because they increase wholeness. And what happens in any growth holarchy is that the whole of one stage becomes part of the whole of the next stage. And then the whole of that stage becomes part of an even bigger whole of the next stage, and so on. So that's why they get more and more and more expansive. So I had been writing books about growth holarchies in a lot of these different areas. So Atman project in the interior of an individual, up from Eden on a culture, and so on. But as I was writing about hierarchy in the first paragraph, it dawned on me that that would get a really bad reception in today's academic world, and that there was something not right about that. And so I looked at all of the growth holarchies that I had studied, and there were well over 100 of them. I mean, just even in developmental psychology, in a book called Integral Psychology, I look at over 100 models of developmental psychology and do a meta-analysis on them to determine what the most common factors are in their stages of growth and development. But I had all sorts of other holarchies. I had linguistic development, stellar development, biological development, just the broad evolutionary sequence itself, from quarks to atoms to molecules to cells to organisms. That's a growth holarchy. So I took those yellow legal pads, which everybody knows, and I would just write one growth holarchy on each sheet of paper, tear the sheet of paper off, write another one on the next, tear it off. So I had well over 100 pages. And I had them all over the floor in the house, and it covered just about the entire floor of my house. And all I would do is, there's somehow, they seem to be all essentially, in some broad sense, similar. But there were some really strong differences. So, I mean, even something like atoms, molecules, cells, organisms, and up the biological tree of increasing complexity and so on. And then there were stages like Jean Gebser's worldviews, archaic to magic to mythic to mental to integral. And it's like, well, how do those fit together? There were Linsky's stages of techno-economic development, foraging, horticultural, agrarian, industrial, informational. How are these things actually going to fit together? So every morning I would get up and literally I would just spend the day walking through the house, looking at all of these holarchies. And the next day I'd get up, do the same thing. And I would do that for weeks. And the first sort of breakthrough came because up to that point I had studied a huge number of the world's more sophisticated metaphysical systems. And one of the common themes that showed up in a lot of them was the notion that a universe comes into being when subject and object are differentiated. Mm. So that had always made a certain kind of sense to me. And so I went through and looked at these 100 plus holarchies, and it became very clear that about half of them were dealing with subjective growth and development, and about half of them were dealing with what was clearly objective growth and development. And so that seemed to work enormously, and that sort of gave me one distinction between these various holarchies. But then it was the second one that was a bit harder. And it took me a bit longer. So day in, day out, walking through, looking at them, walking through, looking at them. And then finally it dawned on me, if you are looking at something like, let's say, Maslow's needs holarchy, that's clearly defining needs in an individual. Now, of course, other individuals can have that and it can be shared and all that, but the needs holarchy itself is just looking at your individual growth needs as you grow and develop. Jean Gebser, so that was an interior, that was a subjective, that was on the subjective pile. And in Gebser's worldviews, those are also subjective. They were interior consciousness, awareness views, but they were collective. They weren't looking just individual. They were looking at what whole cultures had in common. And of course, individuals could sort of be higher or lower, but the overall cultures themselves tended to have the standard organizing principles. If it was magic, it tended to be magic cultures. If it was mythic, tended to be mythic. If it was mental rational, tended to be the rational enlightenment type cultures, and so on. And so what we had here was two fundamental distinctions. Well, I looked through all of the others, and they also divided fairly equally into individual holarchies and collective, or singular and plural. So if we put this all together, then we had, facing this way, we had the left-hand quadrants, which were subjective or interior. And then the right hand were objective or exterior. And then the upper were individual and the lower were collective. So we had the inside and the outside of an individual and a group. And the more I looked at those, the more it really became clear that these were extremely fundamental distinctions needed to get a universe up and running. And so maybe in a bit we can talk about whether I see these as involutionary givens or something that just showed up very, very quickly at the beginning of evolution. They were clearly fundamental. And I believe essentially they go all the way up, all the way down. So what we have is, and these names come just from the way I happened to write the quadrants down the first time. So on the left hand, I did indeed have in the interiors. So there's the interior of the individual, subjective domain. And then there's the interior of the collective, an intersubjective domain. And then there was the interiors on the way you're looking at on this side, and then exteriors over here. And there were the individual exteriors, atoms, molecule, cell, organism, that kind of thing. And then there were the collective interobjective. These are objects, these are interobjective systems. So these turned out to be absolutely central, and they tended to show up all over the place, although almost nobody had ever seen sort of this underlying structure that was giving rise to all these things. And I'll talk about a few of them in just a minute, but they're bloody everywhere.